My name is Zoya. I am 31 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As the hidden founder of a private equity firm, I built my empire in the shadows, while my family paraded around playing high society. Last Saturday, they invited me to my father's lavish retirement party. Between the clinking champagne glasses and the forced smiles, my mother took the microphone and publicly shamed me for not giving my father a grandchild yet. I simply looked at her and revealed that I had given birth 8 months ago, and my sister had maliciously hidden the invitation from them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood bedroom was a sanctuary and a prison. I maintained perfect grades and stayed out of trouble, yet nothing I did was ever enough to earn my mother's affection. That reserved space in her heart belonged exclusively to my older brother and my younger sister. The Sterling Country Club was the pinnacle of elite African American society in Atlanta. It was the kind of place where memberships were passed down through generations and the waitstaff memorized your preferred vintage of champagne. Tonight, the grand ballroom was draped in white orchids and gold silk, all paid for to celebrate the retirement of my father Elias. He had spent 35 years as a respected surgeon, and this anniversary party was supposed to be his crowning moment. Instead, my mother Vivian turned it into a stage for her own vanity. She wore a custom emerald green gown that cost more than my first car, floating between tables of politicians, judges, and corporate executives. I sat at a table near the back with my husband Julian. Julian was a brilliant corporate financial attorney, though my family always dismissed him as a lowly public defender because he did not wear flashy designer labels or boast about his income. We preferred it that way. We watched quietly as my older brother Trey and his wife Chloe worked the room. Trey was the golden child, the supposed genius chief executive officer of a tech startup that my mother constantly bragged about. Chloe stood beside him, cradling her newborn son, soaking up the admiration of every wealthy aunt and uncle in the room. The jazz band stopped playing as my mother stepped up to the crystal podium. She tapped her champagne flute with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the 200 guests. A hush fell over the opulent room. She began her speech by praising my father, recounting his medical achievements and his dedication to our community. But within 2 minutes, she pivoted to her favorite subject, which was always the superiority of her chosen children. She gestured grandly toward Trey and Chloe, who beamed under the spotlight. She announced to the crowd that Trey had brought true glory to the family name by providing the first grandchild the sole heir to the legacy they had worked so hard to build. She called Trey a visionary, a man who understood the weight of his bloodline. The crowd clapped politely, murmuring their agreement. Then my mother locked eyes with me. The warm maternal smile dropped from her face, instantly replaced by a sharp, judgmental sneer that I had known my entire life. It was the exact same look she gave me when I refused to attend medical school, the look that said I was entirely worthless to her. She leaned heavily into the microphone so her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She said, "When are you going to stop being selfish, Zoya? Your father has given you everything, and he deserves more than a daughter who plays pretend in the city. When is it going to be your turn to contribute something meaningful to this family instead of just taking up space?" The silence in the ballroom became heavy and suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from my mother to me. I could feel the pitying stares of the society women who had always viewed me as the family disappointment. My sister Nia, sitting at the front table in a bright pink cocktail dress, covered her mouth to hide a malicious smirk. She thrived on my public humiliation. I felt Julian shift in his seat next to me, his jaw clenching in anger. He was ready to defend me, but I placed a gentle hand on his knee to stop him. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I slowly stood up from my chair, the heavy silk of my dress rustling in the dead quiet room. I walked calmly toward the front of the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. Every step felt like shedding a layer of the insecure girl I used to be. I took the microphone directly from my mother's hand. She looked utterly shocked that I had the audacity to approach the stage, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. I looked out at the sea of wealthy guests, ensuring I had their complete attention, then turned to my father, whose face was pale with second-hand embarrassment. I spoke clearly into the microphone. I said, "It has been 8 months already, Mom. I had a beautiful baby girl 8 months ago." The room erupted into confused murmurs. People began whispering loudly to their table mates. My mother stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and rising panic. I turned my attention fully to my father, softening my voice just a fraction. I told him that he was invited to the hospital the very day she was born. I told him how much I had wanted him there to hold his granddaughter, to sing her the same lullabies he used to sing to me before things went wrong in our family. I said, "It is just too bad that your favorite daughter, Nia, intercepted the baby announcement and maliciously hid the child from you so she could keep the spotlight strictly on Trey." Nia leaped up from her chair so fast it knocked over her crystal water glass. The glass shattered on the floor, but nobody looked down. Nia began screaming hysterically, pointing a manicured finger at me. She yelled that I was a pathological liar, that I was just insanely jealous of Trey and Chloe, and that I was making up a delusional story to ruin a holy family moment. My mother immediately rallied to Nia's side. Vivian signaled frantically to the country club security guards stationed at the doors, demanding they throw me out for disrespecting the family and causing a scene. 2 large men in black suits began walking down the aisle toward me. But I was not the scared 18-year-old girl they had kicked out years ago. I did not argue, I did not yell. I simply pulled my phone from my clutch, walked over to the audio-visual table where the technician was sitting frozen in shock, and plugged my device directly into the main projector feed. The massive screen behind the podium flickered to life. The first image was a high-resolution scan of a FedEx delivery receipt, blown up to 10 feet tall. There was no denying the handwriting. It clearly showed Nia's distinct signature, time-stamped 8 months ago, accepting a package containing the VIP hospital passes and the birth announcement. Nia gasped, her face draining of all color. But I was not finished. I swiped to the next file on my phone. A crisp security video began playing on the giant screen for all 200 guests to see. It showed the front porch of my parents' house. The camera captured Nia receiving the FedEx envelope, opening it, reading the birth announcement, and then walking directly over to the home office. Through the window, the footage clearly showed her feeding the heavy cardstock invitation and the hospital passes straight into a paper shredder. She even smiled as she did it. The ballroom erupted into genuine chaos. Aunts and uncles gasped in horror. My father clutched his chest, staggering backward until he hit the edge of a dining table, his breathing heavy with shock and betrayal. My mother stood completely paralyzed, unable to formulate a single lie to protect her golden children. Julian stood up and walked to my side, offering me his arm. He gave me a proud, reassuring squeeze. We had delivered the first blow, completely dismantling their picture-perfect facade, and it was time to leave them to deal with the wreckage. As we walked down the center aisle toward the exit, passing the stunned faces of Atlanta elite, Trey stood frozen near the doorway. He was sweating profusely, his hands shaking. I leaned in close to his ear, ensuring no one else could hear. I whispered, "By the way, Trey, you should use your baby shower money to pay off that $2 million tax lien before the federal agents freeze your accounts on Monday morning. Your fake tech empire is over, and your investors already know everything." I pulled back, watching the absolute terror wash over my brother's face, and walked out into the warm night air. The drive back to our estate was heavy with the silence of a battle just begun. I slept soundly for the first time in years, finally free from the burden of their secrets. But the next morning, Sunday, my phone began vibrating relentlessly against the nightstand, buzzing like an angry hornet. I picked it up to find over 300 unread messages, missed calls, and social media notifications. Vivian and Chloe had not wasted a single minute sleeping. Instead, they had spent the entire night weaponizing their elite socialite network. An anonymous tip, which was so clearly written in Chloe's distinctively dramatic voice, had been published on the most prominent urban gossip blog in Atlanta. The headline was designed for maximum destruction. It screamed about a desperate, Estranged daughter staging a fake pregnancy reveal just to ruin her father's prestigious retirement gala and steal the spotlight from her successful brother. To back up their ridiculous claim, Chloe had manufactured fake text message screenshots. These forged messages supposedly showed me negotiating with a surrogate mother discussing how to rent a baby for the night, just to humiliate my family. The comment section of the blog was an absolute digital firing squad. Women from my mother's charity boards, the country club planning committees, and the elite social organizations were tearing me apart piece by piece. They called me unhinged, bitterly jealous, and a complete disgrace to the family name. They praised Vivian for being so strong while dealing with such a mentally unstable daughter. It was a masterclass in public manipulation, designed to protect Trey's fragile ego at the cost of my sanity. Then came the direct text messages from my actual relatives. The family group chat, a digital space I had been silently exiled from for the last 5 years, was suddenly active on my phone, just so they could coordinate their attacks. Aunt Beatrice, my mother's oldest sister and most loyal follower, sent a scathing voice note calling me a bitter failure. She said I was still acting out like a rebellious, spiteful teenager who could not stand to see anyone else shine. Her exact text read, "You have been intensely jealous of Trey since you were 18. Just because you threw your life away by refusing to go to medical school does not mean you have the right to ruin his blessing. You chose a life of struggle, Zoya. Now deal with it quietly." Her harsh words sat on the screen, quickly followed by a barrage of agreement from cousins, uncles, and family friends. Through their vicious messages, the twisted narrative of my entire life was laid bare for me to read. They conveniently erased the trauma of my past. They forgot how my parents had completely cut me off financially the very day I refused to take the medical school entrance exam. They forgot how Vivian had packed my belongings into trash bags and left them on the porch, telling me to figure out my own college tuition if I wanted to be so independent. They forgot how I worked 3 grueling jobs waiting tables and tutoring just to afford my accounting textbooks. Meanwhile, they relentlessly praised Trey. They completely ignored the glaring fact that my father had practically handed him a $500,000 seed fund to start a technology company. A company that in 4 years had not produced a single profitable application or software program. In their eyes, Trey was a struggling visionary who just needed time, and I was simply the angry, jealous outcast trying to tear down a successful black man. Julian walked into the bedroom holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He took one look at my glowing screen and the vicious words scrolling past, and his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. As a high-powered corporate financial attorney, his first instinct was immediate, overwhelming legal warfare. He set the coffee mugs down on the dresser with a sharp clank and immediately reached for his laptop. He told me he was going to draft ironclad cease and desist letters before noon. He was ready to sue the blog publisher, my mother, and Chloe for every single dime of defamation and emotional distress he could legally prove. He was absolutely furious that they would dare to drag our innocent daughter into their psychotic public relations stunt. He wanted to crush them right then and there. I reached over and gently placed my hand over his, pushing the laptop screen down until it clicked shut. I smiled coldly, feeling a strange, intoxicating sense of absolute calm washing over me. I told Julian to let them post whatever they wanted. I looked him in the eye and said, "Let them build this massive, towering lie for the entire city to see." The higher they climb their imaginary social ladder built on deceit, the harder the concrete will feel when they finally hit it. I left the bedroom and walked down the long, sunlit hallway of our sprawling estate, heading straight into my private home office. It was time to stop playing defense and take control of the narrative. For the past 6 years, my family genuinely believed I was barely scraping by, working as a low-level financial analyst in a cubicle downtown. What they did not know, what nobody outside of a very tight corporate circle knew, was that I was the anonymous founder and majority stakeholder of a ruthless private equity firm currently managing over $400 million in assets. We specialized in aggressive corporate takeovers, distressed debt restructuring, and liquidating failing companies. I booted up my encrypted terminal, bypassed my standard team of analysts, and logged directly into my firm's central intelligence database. I personally initiated a comprehensive, unforgiving background financial audit on Trey's technology startup. I pulled his public corporate filings, his quarterly tax records, and his vendor credit reports. I dug into the shell corporations he used to move money around. It did not take long for his elaborate house of cards to collapse completely on my screen. His highly praised company was nothing but a hollow shell. He had burned through my father's initial $500,000 seed money within the first 12 months, wasting it on luxury cars, expensive dinners, and leasing a penthouse office space he did not need. Now, according to the data staring back at me, he was drowning in unpaid vendor invoices. He was defaulting on short-term, high-interest loans. But worst of all, I uncovered the exact details of the massive $2 million tax lien from the Internal Revenue Service that I had whispered to him about the night before. Trey was not a visionary chief executive officer. He was a desperate fraud teetering right on the edge of a major federal indictment for tax evasion and corporate mismanagement. I systematically downloaded every single financial document, every missed payment, and every hidden offshore transfer, creating a digital kill switch that I could activate at any moment. While I was meticulously compiling the devastating evidence of my brother's impending criminal downfall, a sharp alert chimed from my secondary monitor. It was a motion notification from a remote security camera. To maintain the illusion that I was financially struggling and keep my family completely in the dark about my wealth, I maintained a lease on a modest, rundown condo across the city in a lower-income neighborhood. My family believed this cramped, depressing apartment was my actual home. I used it as a decoy, letting them send their passive-aggressive holiday cards and occasional condescending letters to that address. It was the perfect cover to keep them underestimating me. I clicked on the live feed from the decoy apartment's front door camera, watching the high-definition video stream onto my screen. A sleek, black, heavily tinted sport utility vehicle pulled up to the cracked sidewalk outside the building. The driver threw the vehicle into park and immediately stepped out to open the rear passenger doors. My brother Trey stepped out first. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, nervously adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer suit and frantically checking his luxury watch. My mother Vivian followed right behind him. She stepped onto the uneven pavement, looking around the neighborhood with a face full of sheer, unadulterated disgust. She dramatically held a designer silk scarf over her nose, as if the very air of the neighborhood was physically offending her elite sensibilities. Finally, a sleazy-looking man in an ill-fitting gray suit stepped out of the vehicle behind them. He was clutching a thick, worn leather briefcase tightly to his chest, looking nervously up at the windows of the building. They were marching in unison up the concrete steps directly to my decoy door. They clearly believed they were about to corner a desperate, impoverished woman and force her into submission. I smiled at the glowing security monitor in my private home office. I had anticipated this exact, desperate move. Grabbing my car keys, I turned to Julian and told him it was time to leave our estate. The decoy condo was only a 10-minute drive across town, and we slipped through the discreet alleyway entrance, just as the heavy, aggressive pounding on the front door began. I took a deep breath. Adjusting my simple cotton sweater to perfectly play the part of the struggling estranged sister and confidently unlocked the deadbolt. Vivian did not even wait for me to open the door fully. She forcefully shoved her way inside her heavy designer perfume, immediately overwhelming the cramped, stale air of the apartment. Trey followed closely behind her, looking highly nervous, but desperately trying to mask it with an arrogant swagger. The sleazy lawyer trailed them, looking around the modest living room with a practiced look of pure contempt. Vivian stood right in the center of the cheap laminate floor, refusing to sit on the staged second-hand sofa I had purchased from a thrift store specifically to maintain this illusion. She wrinkled her nose, glaring at the fake water stains on the ceiling and the peeling paint on the baseboards. She turned to me with eyes full of absolute disgust, shaking her head as if my very existence was a personal insult to her high society reputation. She said, "Look at how you live, Zoya. It is completely pathetic. You are 31 years old, living in a depressing shoebox, married to a man who cannot even afford to put a proper roof over your head." And yet you have the sheer audacity to show up at my prestigious country club wearing a dress you probably rented and try to ruin your brother's impeccable reputation. I leaned calmly against the cheap Formica kitchen island, crossing my arms. Julian stood right beside me like an immovable wall, his face a mask of complete indifference. I asked them what they wanted, knowing exactly why they had brought a lawyer to a rundown apartment on a Sunday morning. The sleazy man in the gray suit did not even bother to introduce himself. He simply unlatched his worn leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slammed them down on the kitchen island right in front of me. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his breast pocket and tapped it aggressively against the bottom signature line. Vivian stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom and false authority. She said, "We are here to clean up your disgusting mess. I am willing to give you $50,000 right now, deposited directly into whatever pathetic little checking account you use. But in exchange, you are going to sign this non-disclosure agreement. You are going to log onto your social media accounts and post a public apology, admitting that you lied about having a baby because you were having a severe mental breakdown. And most importantly, you are going to formally waive any and all future rights to your father's estate. You will never see another dime of our family money, and you will never speak to the press or anyone in our social circle about what happened last night." I stared down at the contract, genuinely amused by their sheer unadulterated audacity. $50,000 was substantially less than what I made in a single hour of trading at my private equity firm. They truly believed they held all the cards. They actually believed they could buy my silence, erase my daughter's existence, and secure their financial future for the price of a mid-range luxury sedan. Before I could even formulate a response, Trey decided to interject. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit, trying desperately to project the image of a fearless, untouchable tech mogul. He looked Julian up and down, taking in Julian's plain black t-shirt and dark denim jeans. Trey let out a loud, condescending laugh. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my husband's chest. "Trey said you should really tell your wife to sign the paper, man. I know you are just a bottom-feeding public defender dragging yourself through traffic court every day dealing with criminals. 50 grand is probably way more money than you have ever seen in your entire life. It could finally pay off whatever massive student loans you are still drowning in. Take the money and get your crazy wife under control before my corporate legal team decides to crush you both into the dirt." Julian did not blink. He simply tilted his head, watching Trey the way a seasoned scientist observes a particularly stupid insect. Trey mistook Julian's silence for intimidation. He took a step closer, his blinding arrogance completely preventing him from seeing the absolute danger standing right in front of him. Trey continued bragging, his voice getting louder and more aggressively boastful. "He said my software startup is going public in exactly 6 months. We are preparing for a massive initial public offering that is going to shake the industry. I am about to be a billionaire, Zoya. A literal billionaire. I am protecting my corporate assets from desperate leeches. When my company hits the stock exchange, the financial media is going to dig into my entire background. I cannot have an estranged psychotic sister popping out of the woodwork begging for handouts and making up crazy lies about secret babies to extort me. You are a massive liability to my brand. Sign the paper, take the 50 grand, and disappear back into your miserable life." Julian finally moved. He let out a low, deep laugh that echoed loudly in the small, cramped kitchen. It was not a nervous laugh. It was the dark, predatory laugh of a top-tier corporate financial attorney who spent his days ruthlessly dismantling Fortune 500 companies in federal courtrooms. Julian reached out and casually picked up the thick legal contract. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense paragraphs. He looked directly at the sleazy lawyer and shook his head in genuine professional disappointment. Julian said whoever drafted this absolute garbage should be immediately disbarred. Clause 4 is completely unenforceable in the state of Georgia. Your indemnification language is an absolute joke. And you failed to properly define the scope of the confidentiality terms. You clearly downloaded a cheap template from a free internet website and forgot to change the jurisdictional brackets. The lawyer's face turned bright red, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish on a dock. Julian did not hand the contract back. Instead, he turned to the small, cheap paper shredder I kept plugged in at the corner of the kitchen counter. With one smooth, deliberate motion, Julian fed the entire stack of legal documents right into the machine. The loud, grinding noise of the shredder filled the room, eating the extortion attempt page by page until absolutely nothing was left but thin white strips of trash settling in the plastic bin. Vivian gasped loudly, clutching the expensive pearls at her throat. She screamed, asking, "What is wrong with you, calling Julian an absolute animal and a thug?" She looked at me and demanded that I control my husband before she called the police. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout to make itself heard. I simply reached into my oversized designer tote bag, pulled out a single, crisp piece of paper and slid it face up across the Formica kitchen island until it stopped right in front of Trey's trembling hands. I looked right into my brother's eyes, dropping my completely calm facade, and told him to read it out loud. It was a formal expedited foreclosure notice from the primary lending bank for his $3 million luxury suburban McMansion. The document detailed 6 months of entirely missed mortgage payments, escalating penalty fees, frozen equity lines, and a final eviction date set for the end of the current month. Trey looked down at the paper and all the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and hollow. His arrogant, boastful posture collapsed completely in a matter of seconds. His hands began to shake so violently that he had to physically grip the edge of the kitchen island just to keep himself standing upright. Vivian, instantly sensing the massive and sudden shift in power in the room, stepped forward aggressively. She demanded to know what the paper was, reaching out and trying to snatch it from the counter. She asked Trey what I had given him, her voice rising in panic. But Trey was entirely locked in a state of full survival panic. Before Vivian's fingers could even touch the foreclosure notice, Trey snatched it up, crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist, and aggressively grabbed his mother by her expensive silk sleeve. He stammered uncontrollably, telling Vivian they had to leave the apartment right now, violently dragging her backward toward the front door. Vivian yelled in protest, entirely confused and furious at being manhandled. But Trey practically shoved her and the terrified lawyer out into the hallway, slamming my cheap apartment door shut behind them. The silence returned to the decoy condo, heavy, final, and incredibly satisfying. I turned to Julian, watching the black sport utility vehicle speed away recklessly on the security monitor. I crossed my arms and smiled. I said, "It is time to show them where Dad's retirement money really went." We drove back to our actual estate in comfortable silence, the adrenaline from the decoy condo still humming in my veins. Once inside the massive walls of my true home, Julian immediately took a seat beside me at the dual monitors in my office. We bypassed the standard search engines and dove directly into the secured financial databases that my private equity firm used for high-level corporate espionage. My father, Elias, had spent 35 years working grueling shifts as a top-tier surgeon. He lived relatively frugally, investing his money in blue-chip stocks and prime commercial real estate across Atlanta. By all my previous calculations, his retirement portfolio should have been an untouchable fortress worth well over $7 million. But as Julian rapidly decrypted the latest banking filings under my father's social security number, a completely different and utterly horrifying picture began to emerge on the screen. Julian leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he traced a massive transfer of assets that had occurred exactly 14 months ago. He pointed to a series of heavily obfuscated legal documents. He said, "Look at this structure right here. They did not just borrow from him, Zoya. They completely stripped him bare." I pulled up the primary document. It was a legally binding contract establishing something called the Legacy Family Trust. On paper, it was marketed as a protective tax shelter designed to shield my father's wealth from estate taxes and medical liabilities. But reading through the dense manipulative clauses buried on page 40, the true trap became sickeningly clear. Trey and my sister Nia had secretly coerced our father into signing over $5 million in liquid stock and premium property into this trust. Elias clearly thought he was securing the family's generational wealth. In reality, the fine print granted Trey absolute uncontested power of attorney over every single penny. My stomach churned as we tracked the outgoing wire transfers from the trust over the past year. Trey had been bleeding our father dry. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly into his failing tech startup to create the illusion of explosive growth for his phantom investors. Even worse, massive chunks of the retirement fund were being routed to Chloe's personal accounts to fund her lavish Instagram-obsessed lifestyle. My father's lifelong blood, sweat, and tears were paying for Chloe's endless trips to Paris, her customized designer wardrobes, and the down payment on Trey's heavily mortgaged luxury mansion. They had robbed an old man blind while smiling in his face and demanding gratitude. Julian cracked his knuckles, a dark look crossing his usually calm face. He asked if I wanted him to call the district attorney right now and file elder abuse charges. I shook my head, my eyes locked on a specific line item in Trey's corporate debt ledger. I told Julian that calling the police would just give Trey a chance to play the victim and hire a slick defense attorney. I wanted to dismantle his life brick by brick legally and financially until he had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I pulled up the financial records for a major server hosting and software licensing vendor based in California. This specific vendor was the absolute backbone of Trey's entire tech startup. Without their servers, Trey's application would completely crash, and his remaining fake investors would instantly demand their money back. Currently, Trey owed this vendor over $400,000 in past due invoices. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the chief financial officer of my private equity firm. I gave a direct, non-negotiable order. I instructed him to reach out to the California vendor immediately and offer to buy Trey's outstanding corporate debt at an 80% premium in cash by the end of the business day. The vendor, desperate to recoup their massive losses from my deadbeat brother, accepted the buyout within 30 minutes. Julian watched the confirmation email hit my inbox and let out a low whistle. With a single wire transfer, my anonymous holding company was now legally Trey's largest and most aggressive corporate creditor. I held the absolute power to liquidate his assets, freeze his business accounts, and shut off his company's servers with a single phone call. The trap was set and the jaws were completely locked. I decided to take the rest of the afternoon off to run some errands for my daughter. I drove to Buckhead, the most affluent shopping district in Atlanta, to pick up a custom-ordered stroller from an exclusive high-end baby boutique. The boutique was a haven for wealthy socialites, featuring crystal chandeliers, complimentary champagne, and tiny cashmere sweaters that cost more than most people made in a week. I was casually browsing a rack of organic cotton onesies when I heard a loud, piercing, and incredibly obnoxious voice echoing across the quiet store. It was Chloe. She was parading through the boutique with her newborn son strapped to her chest in a ridiculously expensive carrier, trailed by two women from my mother's country club. Chloe spotted me immediately. Instead of turning away out of embarrassment after the disaster at my decoy condo, her arrogant, entitled nature took full control. She practically strutted over to me, a smug, venomous smile plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She loudly announced her presence, ensuring the entire store could hear her. She said, "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the slums. I am genuinely surprised they even let you walk through the front doors of a place like this, Zoya. Are you looking for the clearance rack? Because I think they throw all the defective items in a bin in the back alley." The two country club women snickered loudly, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. I calmly placed the cotton onesie back on the gold hanger, turning to face my sister-in-law. I did not look angry. I looked entirely bored. Chloe reached down and dramatically adjusted the tiny monogrammed socks on her baby's feet. She projected her voice even louder, desperate for an audience. She boasted that she was just buying her son his third pair of custom Gucci loafers because he was a true legacy child who deserved absolutely nothing but the finest luxury. She looked at my simple, unbranded clothing and let out a harsh, mocking laugh, asking what my imaginary baby was wearing today. I took a step closer to Chloe, invading her personal space just enough to make her shift uncomfortably on her expensive heels. I kept my voice low, smooth, and chillingly calm, ensuring only she and her friends could hear the absolute finality in my tone. I looked at the ridiculous designer shoes on her baby and smiled. I said custom Gucci is very nice, Chloe. It really is. But I hear it is incredibly hard to wash by hand when the city shuts off the water to your massive house for 3 months of unpaid utility bills. Chloe's smug smile completely vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp look of genuine confusion and rising panic. She opened her mouth to snap back to call me a liar, but the words died in her throat. She knew I was right. She had been hiding the final shut-off notices from her country club friends for weeks, terrified that the illusion of her wealthy lifestyle was cracking. She nervously adjusted her designer handbag, her eyes darting toward the sales counter where the boutique manager was currently running her transaction for a pile of cashmere blankets. I did not wait for her to formulate an excuse. I turned my back on her entirely, walking gracefully toward the front entrance of the boutique. As my hand touched the polished brass handle of the glass door, the sharp, unmistakable beep of the credit card machine echoed through the quiet store. The boutique manager looked at the screen, her professional smile faltering slightly. She looked up at Chloe, her voice carrying a tone of polite but firm embarrassment. The manager said, "I am so sorry, ma'am, but your American Express Black Card has been firmly declined. Do you happen to have another form of payment we could try today?" I glanced back over my shoulder one last time. Chloe was frozen perfectly in place, her face burning an angry, humiliated shade of red as the country club women stared at her in utter shock. Her entire fake world was collapsing right there in the middle of Buckhead. I pushed the glass door open and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The financial chokehold had officially begun. By Tuesday morning, the ripple effects of my strategic acquisitions were already tearing through my family's fabricated reality. I was sitting at my massive mahogany desk on the top floor of my downtown high-rise building, reviewing the latest quarterly projections for my private equity firm. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a view I had earned through years of relentless grinding while my family was busy treating me like a disposable outcast. My secure intercom buzzed softly, breaking the quiet concentration of my office. My executive assistant spoke, her voice laced with professional confusion. She informed me that a highly agitated woman was down in the main lobby, aggressively demanding to speak with Zoya, the administrative assistant. The woman was throwing a massive temper tantrum, threatening to call the police if the front desk did not grant her immediate access to my floor. I checked the lobby security feed on my secondary monitor. It was my younger sister, Nia. She looked entirely out of place. Nia usually meticulously curated her appearance for her wealthy social circles, but today she looked frantic and disheveled. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her hair was hastily pulled back, and she was nervously chewing on her perfectly manicured thumbnail. The rats were finally beginning to realize that the ship was sinking, and they were scrambling for a lifeboat. I pressed the intercom button and instructed security to grant her a temporary visitor badge and escort her directly to my office. I wanted to see exactly how low she was willing to sink to save herself. 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open. Nia stepped inside, her eyes immediately darting around the expansive, luxurious room. She took in the custom modern art on the walls, the imported leather seating area, and the sweeping panoramic view of the city. Her face twisted in a mixture of awe and deep-seated confusion. She clearly could not comprehend how the sister she viewed as a complete failure was sitting behind a desk that looked like it belonged to a Fortune 500 chief executive officer. But her ingrained arrogance quickly overrode her confusion. She convinced herself of the narrative she wanted to believe. She let out a breath and smirked, walking over to one of the leather guest chairs. She said, "Wow. Zoya, you are incredibly lucky your powerful boss is out of town today. If he caught you sitting at his desk pretending to run things, he would probably fire you on the spot." I did not correct her. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands on the armrests, and told her to sit down. I asked her why she was causing a scene in a corporate lobby on a Tuesday morning. Naya dropped her heavy designer bag onto the floor and leaned forward, dropping all pretenses of sisterly affection. Her eyes were darting nervously toward the closed oak doors. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She said things are falling apart, Zoya. Trey is completely losing his mind. Half of his corporate servers were shut down yesterday because some anonymous holding company bought his vendor debt and froze his accounts. His investors are calling the house nonstop, threatening federal lawsuits. Vivian is running around trying to pawn her old jewelry just to keep the country club membership active. The entire family is going down in flames, and I refuse to go down with them. I kept my expression entirely neutral, acting as a passive observer to the destruction I had personally orchestrated. I asked her what any of this had to do with me. Nia unzipped her bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She placed it right in the center of the mahogany desk, tapping her manicured finger against the thick paper. She told me that she had the key to completely destroying Trey. She said that inside the envelope were the original, unredacted financial documents for the Legacy Family Trust. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that Trey had deliberately forged our father's signature on the secondary transfer forms. It detailed every single illegal wire transfer he made to his failing tech company and to his wife's personal checking accounts. It was the smoking gun that could send him to federal prison for decades. I looked at the envelope, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. Nia was not offering this out of guilt or a sudden desire to protect our father. She was using our father's stolen retirement fund as a bargaining chip for her own survival. I looked up at her and asked what she wanted in return for the documents. Nia smiled, a predatory, sickeningly sweet expression that mirrored our mother perfectly. She leaned back in the chair, crossing her legs. She said she knew my boss must value me if he let me run his office while he was away. She demanded that I use my influence to secure her a high-level executive position at this private equity firm. She wanted the title of Vice President of Public Relations, a corner office on this exact floor, and a guaranteed starting salary of $250,000 a year plus stock options. She said that once she had the employment contract signed and secured, she would hand over the envelope and let me take all the credit for exposing Trey. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. I asked her why she was so desperate to abandon her golden brother right before his highly anticipated initial public offering. I pushed her, asking what else she was hiding. Nia let out a sharp, bitter laugh that echoed off the glass walls. She shook her head, her eyes gleaming with toxic delight at the prospect of ruining someone else to elevate herself. She said there is no initial public offering, Zoya. Trey's company is completely dead in the water. But that is not even the worst part. His entire perfect, untouchable family image is a massive, pathetic lie. She leaned in closer, savoring the destructive secret she was about to drop. She told me that Chloe's newborn baby, the supposed heir to the family legacy that my mother had been bragging about for months, was not even Trey's biological child. I felt my jaw tighten, but I did not interrupt her. Nia continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of malicious gossip. She revealed that Chloe had been having a reckless affair with her personal fitness trainer for almost a year. Trey found out about the affair 3 months into the pregnancy, but instead of divorcing her, his fragile ego and his desperate need to maintain his image as the ultimate successful black tech mogul forced him to cover it up. He was paying the personal trainer a massive monthly stipend out of our father's stolen trust fund just to keep the man quiet and far away from Atlanta. Nia laughed again, calling Trey a pathetic, weak man who was paying another man to raise a child that was not even his all, while letting our mother parade the baby around the country club like a trophy. The sheer depravity of my family was staggering. They were not just thieves, they were deeply, fundamentally broken people who would burn everything to the ground just to keep up appearances. I processed the massive bombshell Nia had just handed me. It was the final piece of ammunition I needed to completely obliterate their social standing and their financial future. I looked at Nia, who was sitting there looking incredibly proud of herself, fully expecting me to beg my imaginary boss to hire her. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that made Nia visibly flinch. I slowly reached my hand across the smooth surface of my desk and pressed a small, glowing red button on my sleek audio console. A soft, automated chime echoed through the office. I looked directly into Nia's greedy eyes. I told her that the entire conversation we just had, including her explicit demands for corporate extortion and her detailed confession about Chloe's affair and Trey's hush money, had just been recorded in high-definition audio. I informed her that the file was already uploaded to my secure encrypted cloud server. Nia jumped up from the leather chair as if she had been physically struck. Her face morphed from arrogant confidence into absolute, unadulterated terror. She pointed a shaking finger at me, raising her voice to a frantic yell. She screamed that I was insane. She said I could not do that recording her was illegal, and that my boss was going to instantly fire me for conducting unauthorized surveillance in his private corporate office. She lunged forward, trying to reach across the desk to grab the audio console. I stood up abruptly, my chair rolling back loudly against the hardwood floor. My presence commanded the room, freezing her in her tracks. I said, "I do not negotiate with economic terrorists, Nia." She stared at me, her chest heaving, tears of panic finally brimming in her eyes. I walked out from behind the mahogany desk, stepping into the center of the room. I gestured to the expansive office, the expensive artwork, and the breathtaking view of the city skyline. I told her to look around very carefully. I told her there is no boss, there is no executive assistant position. I am the anonymous founder of this private equity firm. I am the one who orchestrated the hostile buyout of Trey's vendor debt. I own this firm, I own this corporate floor, and I own the very building you are standing in right now. Nia staggered backward, her high heels catching on the edge of the imported Persian rug. The absolute shock of the revelation hit her like a physical blow. The sister she had mocked, belittled, and plotted against her entire life was actually the most powerful person she had ever met. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to try and backtrack her betrayal, but no words came out. She just let out a pathetic, suffocated sob. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for building security. I calmly requested that 2 guards come up to the top floor immediately to escort a hostile trespasser off the premises. Within 60 seconds, the heavy oak doors opened again. 2 large security guards stepped into the room. Nia did not even try to fight them. She was completely broken, crying hysterically as they took her by the arms and led her out of the office, leaving the manila envelope sitting abandoned on my desk. I sat back down in my ergonomic chair and picked up my personal cell phone. I navigated to my secure files and attached the crisp, clear audio clip of Nia detailing every single disgusting fact about Chloe's affair, the personal trainer, and the fake paternity. I opened a new text message and selected Chloe's private phone number. I attached the audio file. I did not write a long paragraph. I did not offer any explanation or demand any apologies. I simply typed 2 words into the message box. TikTok. I pressed send, locked my phone, and turned my attention back to the financial markets, ready to watch my family's empire burn to ash. I picked up my secure office line and dialed a private unlisted number. The audio file I sent to Chloe was just the appetizer. It was finally time for the main course. The line connected directly to the senior partners of a massive venture capital group based in New York City. What my brother Trey never realized during his arrogant networking events and flashy pitch meetings was that his 3 largest angel investors were actually shell entities quietly controlled by my private equity firm. I had personally approved their initial seed investments years ago, fully anticipating his eventual failure, keeping him on a very short leash, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to yank it. I spoke clearly into the receiver, instructing the senior partners to execute the immediate withdrawal protocols. I cited the strict morality clause embedded deeply in their investment contracts, using the audio of his extortion attempt and his desperate cover-up of Chloe's affair as justifiable legal cause. I also directed them to cite gross financial mismanagement due to the massive vendor debt I had just purchased earlier that morning. There is no loyalty or forgiveness in corporate finance, only leverage and execution. Within 20 minutes of that single phone call, the corporate slaughter was fully executed. Trey received 3 simultaneous, legally binding emails from his primary financial backers. They formally withdrew all pending capital, froze his current operating accounts, and demanded immediate repayment of their initial multi-million-dollar investments. The digital walls were closing in, cutting off his oxygen supply completely. The total collapse of his fake tech empire happened almost overnight. By Wednesday morning, Trey's highly publicized software startup was nothing more than a smoking crater in the financial district. When his unpaid software engineers and marketing executives arrived at their expensive downtown office space, they found the heavy glass doors completely padlocked shut. The property management company, acting swiftly on the vendor default notices I had triggered, had officially evicted the company before sunrise. Security guards were posted outside the entrance, actively turning away angry employees who were demanding their paychecks and threatening lawsuits. Trey was locked out of his own building. His corporate credit cards were instantly declined when he tried to buy his usual expensive morning coffee, and his phone was blowing up with furious, threatening calls from his staff, his unpaid contractors, and the local business media. He was drowning in a spectacular public relations nightmare. Like any spoiled child who had never faced a real, devastating consequence in his entire sheltered life, he panicked entirely. He abandoned his employees on the sidewalk without a word. He jumped into his heavily mortgaged luxury car and drove recklessly through the suburban streets, running red lights and speeding all the way to my parents' house. He burst through the heavy oak front door of my childhood home, sweating profusely. His expensive designer tie loosened and his eyes wide with absolute terror. Vivian was thankfully out at her weekly country club brunch, leaving my father alone in his quiet study reading the morning paper. Trey did not even bother to knock. He fell to his knees directly in front of Elias. He put on the performance of a lifetime, tapping into 30 years of practiced manipulation. He cried genuine tears of panic, claiming a massive, coordinated corporate conspiracy was unfairly targeting him right before his highly anticipated initial public offering. He spun a wild, elaborate tale about jealous competitors trying to steal his proprietary software code. He begged my father to take out a massive second mortgage on the family home, claiming he just needed a temporary bridge loan to cover the gap until his new international investors wired their massive funds. He promised to pay Elias back with double interest within a month. Elias, completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that his son had already secretly stolen his entire retirement fund, looked at his weeping boy with deep, unquestioning paternal concern. The golden child was asking for help, and my father had been conditioned his entire life to provide it. Elias agreed without a single second thought. He grabbed his coat and his car keys, promising Trey he would go straight to the primary bank branch downtown to secure the emergency loan immediately. But Elias never made it to the loan officer's desk. Julian was already waiting for him. I had perfectly anticipated Trey's desperate pivot to my father's home equity, so Julian had parked his car directly outside the grand entrance of my father's bank early that morning. As Elias walked through the heavy, revolving glass doors, looking highly anxious but fiercely determined to save his son's company, Julian stepped right into his path. Julian greeted him respectfully, but with a cold, stern firmness that immediately stopped my father in his tracks. Julian gently but firmly guided Elias away from the busy teller lines and over to a quiet, secluded seating area in the far corner of the marble lobby. He asked Elias to sit down in the heavy leather chair, placing a thick black portfolio on the small glass table between them. Elias looked confused and highly defensive. He checked his watch and told Julian he did not have time for any family drama today because Trey was in a critical, life-altering business emergency. Julian did not argue. He did not raise his voice to match my father's irritation. He simply unzipped the leather portfolio and began pulling out the receipts. Julian laid the documents out one by one, methodically constructing a terrifying, undeniable timeline of financial abuse. First, he showed Elias the original unredacted paperwork for the Legacy Family Trust that Nia had provided. He pointed a steady finger directly to the secondary transfer authorizations. Julian explained exactly how the complex legal jargon was specifically designed to strip Elias of all his power and grant Trey absolute, uncontested control over the accounts. Then Julian slid over the massive stack of bank statements. He showed Elias the exact dates and the exact amounts of every single wire transfer Trey had initiated over the past 14 months. He showed my father how hundreds of thousands of dollars were funneled out of his hard-earned retirement savings and dumped directly into the failing startup to cover payroll and luxury office leases. He highlighted the massive transfers paying for Chloe's designer shopping sprees, her five-star luxury vacations, and most devastatingly, the monthly hush money payments to her personal fitness trainer to cover up the fake paternity. Elias picked up the papers with trembling hands. His eyes darted frantically across the highlighted numbers, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. He desperately tried to find a mistake, muttering that Trey would never do this to him, that these documents had to be sophisticated forgeries created by a jealous rival. Julian leaned in, his voice low and utterly uncompromising. He told Elias to look closely at the signature lines. He showed my father exactly how Trey had meticulously forged his handwriting on every single transfer request. The realization hit my father like a physical blow to the chest. The illusion of his perfect, incredibly successful son shattered completely right there in the quiet corner of the bank lobby. Elias dropped the papers onto the glass table as if they were burning his hands. He buried his face in his weathered palms, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he broke down weeping in public. The proud, stoic surgeon who had dedicated his entire adult life to building a respectable legacy finally realized he was entirely destitute. The wealth he had worked 35 grueling years to accumulate was gone, stolen by the very son he had worshipped and protected at my expense. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, asking Julian what he was supposed to do now. He realized with absolute horror that mortgaging the house would leave him and Vivian completely homeless and buried in inescapable debt. Julian watched the older man cry, offering no false comfort and no gentle reassurances. He let the crushing weight of the absolute truth settle firmly on my father's shoulders. Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and delivered the final ultimatum. He looked my broken father directly in the eyes. He said, "Zoya can save you. She has the power, the resources, and the capital to fix all of this right now. But you have to make a choice today, Elias. You have to choose between the brutal truth or your wife's toxic delusions." Julian left my father sitting alone in that quiet bank lobby, wrestling with the ultimate choice between preserving his shattered pride and facing the devastating reality of his stolen life. While my father's world was collapsing downtown under the weight of undeniable financial crimes, I was across the city honoring a prior commitment. I was attending an exclusive philanthropic luncheon at the Piedmont Heights Country Club. This sprawling estate was the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's black elite social calendar. It was a space heavily gatekept by old money, where reputations were fiercely guarded and scandalous rumors were traded like high-value currency. I sat at a private corner table near the floor-to-ceiling windows, sipping sparkling water. I was completely unbothered by the quiet, judgmental whispers of the prominent women seated nearby. Many of them had undoubtedly read Chloe's fake blog posts about my supposed surrogate pregnancy. They were staring at me, sipping their mimosas, waiting for me to show signs of a public mental breakdown. I simply ignored them. I knew the truth was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown was nearing its final explosive seconds. I did not have to wait long for the first detonation. The heavy mahogany doors of the main dining room swung open abruptly, and Chloe practically burst inside. She was not parading around like the smug, untouchable socialite I had encountered at the luxury baby boutique just 24 hours earlier. Today, she looked completely unhinged and utterly terrified. Her oversized designer sunglasses were askew. Her perfectly applied makeup was visibly smudged from crying, and she was clutching her expensive leather handbag against her chest like a life preserver. She scanned the crowded room frantically, ignoring the surprised gasps of the wealthy women she usually tried to impress. When her eyes finally locked onto me, a look of sheer desperation washed over her face. She marched directly over to my corner table, her high heels clicking erratically against the polished marble floor. She did not even bother to say hello or attempt to maintain her usual haughty demeanor. She slumped heavily into the empty chair across from me, leaning entirely over the pristine white tablecloth, invading my personal space with her frantic, nervous energy. Chloe's voice was a ragged, pathetic whisper. She begged me not to release the audio recording of Nia exposing her affair to anyone else. She confessed that Trey had completely lost his mind since his massive investors pulled their funding that morning. She told me he was currently tearing their sprawling mansion apart, screaming at his corporate lawyers over the phone, and desperately looking for expensive items to pawn just to keep his remaining servers running. But Chloe made it entirely clear that her real terror was not about Trey's impending financial ruin or his potential criminal charges. Her absolute deepest fear was my mother. Chloe admitted that Vivian was her only remaining lifeline to high society. If Vivian found out that the supposed heir to the family legacy was actually the biological son of a personal fitness trainer, she would cut Chloe off instantly. Chloe cried genuine tears of selfish desperation, claiming my mother would systematically destroy her life. She said Vivian would make sure she was blacklisted from every country club charity board, an elite social circle in the entire state of Georgia. Chloe pleaded with me, claiming she would be left with absolutely nothing, forced to go back to the working-class neighborhood she had spent her entire adult life trying to escape. She begged me to have mercy, asking what dollar amount it would take to buy my permanent silence. Before I could even formulate a response to her pathetic display of greed and self-preservation, a loud, sharp voice sliced through the elegant hum of the dining room. It was my mother. Vivian was marching aggressively across the dining room floor, flanked by two of her wealthiest, most influential friends. She had apparently spotted us from the valet entrance and decided to make a grand, theatrical entrance. Vivian descended upon our table like a vicious bird of prey protecting its nest. She did not bother to ask what we were discussing or why her daughter-in-law was crying. She immediately defaulted to her absolute favorite narrative, which was aggressively protecting her golden children from the family outcast. She slammed her manicured hand down on our table, rattling the crystal water glasses and drawing the attention of every single prominent woman in the room. She started yelling at the top of her lungs, ensuring her performance was witnessed by her peers. She demanded to know why I was relentlessly harassing her vulnerable daughter-in-law. She called me a vicious, jealous monster for cornering a new mother who was already dealing with the immense stress of a massive corporate sabotage perpetrated by ruthless anonymous investors. The moment Vivian arrived and provided an audience, Chloe's entire demeanor shifted with terrifying calculated speed. The desperate begging woman who had just offered to negotiate her silence vanished instantly. Chloe immediately weaponized her tears, morphing right back into the helpless, innocent victim. She began hyperventilating loudly, clutching her chest and crying out that I was physically threatening her. She lied flawlessly, claiming I was saying horrible, unforgivable things about her newborn baby, just to be cruel. Chloe slumped back in her chair, faking a severe panic attack. She gasped loudly for air, burying her face in her trembling hands, while Vivian's wealthy friends rushed over to fan her face with their leather-bound menus and offer her soothing words. It was a masterful, sickening performance designed to isolate me and cement my status as the ultimate villain of the family. Vivian turned her absolute fury entirely on me, completely emboldened by Chloe's theatrical distress. Her face was flushed with rage as she pointed a shaking finger right at my face, leaning over the table to intimidate me. She shouted that I was an absolute disgrace to the family name and a bitter failure who could not stand to see anyone else happy. She declared in front of the entire country club that I was officially dead to her. She swore that I would never be allowed near her perfect grandson, the only child who mattered to the family legacy. She raised her voice even louder, announcing that she was going to hire an expensive legal team to file a permanent restraining order against me and my broke husband to protect Trey and Chloe from our psychotic jealousy. She demanded that I stand up, pack my things, and leave the country club immediately before she had armed security drag me out by my hair and throw me into the street. She stood tall, breathing heavily, looking around the room, waiting for the applause of her peers for defending her family so fiercely. I did not yell back. I did not try to defend myself against her ridiculous accusations, nor did I attempt to expose Chloe's sudden theatrical performance to the crowd. True power does not engage in petty emotional screaming matches. I simply stared at my mother, letting a cold, absolute silence settle over our table. The surrounding guests were completely quiet, watching the drama unfold with rapt attention. I slowly reached into my designer tote bag. Julian had pulled several heavy legal strings the day before to expedite the processing of a covert DNA test. He had utilized a discarded pacifier we legally acquired through a private investigator who had been tracking Chloe's movements for weeks. I pulled out a crisp sealed, heavy stock envelope bearing the official embossed logo of a premier medical diagnostics laboratory. I held the envelope lightly between my fingers, feeling the immense weight of the truth contained inside. I dropped the thick envelope directly into Vivian's lap. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. I looked my mother directly in the eyes and said, "You wanted a grandchild so badly, Mom. You paraded that baby around this exact club like a blue ribbon prize just to spite me. You should probably check exactly what breed you got." Vivian instantly stopped yelling. The absolute certainty in my voice pierced right through her arrogant fury. She looked down at the official medical envelope resting in her lap, then looked sharply at Chloe. Chloe instantly stopped hyperventilating. The fake panic attack vanished completely, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Chloe lunged forward across the table, knocking over a crystal glass, trying desperately to snatch the envelope away. She screamed for Vivian not to look at it, claiming frantically that it was just another one of my psychotic, fabricated lies to destroy their family. But Vivian was faster. Her deeply ingrained suspicion and her desperate need for control overrode her loyalty to her daughter-in-law. She swatted Chloe's hand away, roughly tore the heavy paper seal open, and pulled out the official laboratory documents. She quickly scanned the bold, highlighted text on the front page. The medical terminology was clear and unforgiving. The document stated with 99.9% scientific certainty that the child possessed absolutely zero genetic match to my brother Trey. The blood drained entirely from Vivian's face in a matter of seconds, replacing her flushed rage with a sickly, ghostly pallor. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers, drifting slowly to the floor for everyone to see. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, clutching her chest as her eyes rolled back into her head. She collapsed sideways, fainting completely, dead away in the middle of the crowded dining room. Total chaos erupted as women screamed and rushed forward to catch her before she hit the floor. In the midst of the absolute pandemonium, Chloe did not stay to help the woman she called her second mother. She grabbed her handbag, turned on her designer heels, and ran out of the country club as fast as she possibly could, leaving her entire fake life behind. I left the Piedmont Heights Country Club before the paramedics even managed to load my unconscious mother onto their stretcher. I had absolutely no interest in playing the role of the frantically concerned daughter for an audience of gossiping, judgmental socialites. I walked out of the double doors, handed my ticket to the valet, and drove straight back to the absolute peace and impenetrable security of my actual home. I needed to wash the toxic energy of that luncheon off my skin. A few hours later, the private intercom at my main security gate buzzed loudly, echoing through the quiet halls of my house. Julian had given my father our real address before leaving him utterly devastated in that downtown bank lobby earlier in the morning. I pulled up the high-definition security feed on my tablet. I watched as my father slowly drove his conservative luxury sedan up to the massive wrought iron gates of my property. For 30 years, my father had viewed himself as the ultimate patriarch, the most successful and intelligent person in our entire bloodline. He had allowed my mother to banish me to what they both believed was a life of financial struggle and mediocrity. Now, sitting behind the steering wheel of his car, he was forced to stare up at an $8 million architectural masterpiece. My estate sat on 10 pristine, heavily wooded acres of prime Atlanta real estate. It was a sprawling modern fortress of floor-to-ceiling glass, imported dark stone, and cascading water features. It was a physical manifestation of the power and wealth I had built entirely in the shadows. I pressed the button to open the gates. I watched on the cameras as my father drove slowly up the winding, manicured driveway. He parked his car near my expansive 5-car garage, stepping out onto the cobblestone slowly, as if the gravity of his surroundings was physically pushing him down. He looked up at the towering glass entryway, his face pale and completely stripped of his usual confident, authoritative demeanor. The stark, undeniable contrast between this breathtaking estate and the cheap, depressing decoy condo he thought I lived in finally shattered the last remaining pieces of his fabricated reality. He realized with crushing certainty that he had completely underestimated the daughter he had thrown away. Julian opened the massive mahogany front door before my father could even ring the bell. Julian did not offer a warm greeting or a comforting handshake. He simply stepped aside, gesturing for Elias to enter the grand foyer. My father walked inside, his eyes, tracing the vaulted ceilings, the modern art installations, and the sheer quiet luxury of my life. He followed Julian into the expansive formal living room where the afternoon sun was pouring through the massive windows. I was sitting on a custom white linen sofa, and sitting right beside me playing quietly with a set of wooden blocks was my 8-month-old daughter Maya. My father stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw her. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room instantly shifted, replaced by a wave of raw, unfiltered emotion that seemed to knock the breath entirely out of his lungs. He had spent his entire morning discovering that his son had robbed him blind, and that his wife had been parading around a child that carried no trace of his bloodline. He was a man completely hollowed out by betrayal. But looking at Maya, looking at the undeniable resemblance she shared with our family, the absolute truth finally hit him. This was his first grandchild. This was his real legacy, breathing, smiling, and sitting right in front of him in a house he had never helped build. Elias did not say a word. He took a slow, trembling step forward. His eyes filled with heavy, agonizing tears that immediately spilled over his weathered cheeks. I did not stop him as he approached the sofa. He dropped heavily to his knees right in front of the coffee table, completely abandoning his lifelong pride. He reached out with shaking hands, and I gently lifted Maya, placing her into his arms for the very first time. My father let out a broken, gut-wrenching sob. He pulled Maya close to his chest, burying his face in her soft hair, weeping with a depth of sorrow and regret that I had never seen from him in my entire life. He repeatedly whispered how sorry he was, apologizing for missing her birth, apologizing for failing to protect me, and apologizing for letting my mother and my sister steal this precious, irreplaceable moment from him. It was a deeply emotional, profoundly tearful moment. For a brief, fleeting second, I saw the loving, protective father I had always desperately wanted as a little girl. But toxic family dynamics are a deeply ingrained disease, and tears alone do not cure them. After several long minutes, my father slowly handed Maya back to me. He wiped his face with a silk handkerchief, heavily clearing his throat, as he struggled to pull the fragments of his patriarchal authority back together. He sat down heavily on the armchair across from me, leaning forward with a look of desperate, calculating panic returning to his eyes. He told me that Julian had explained everything at the bank. He knew about the stolen retirement funds, the forged trust documents, and Trey's impending federal indictment. He also revealed that he had just received a hysterical phone call from one of my mother's country club friends, informing him about Vivian fainting over the DNA test and Chloe running away from the luncheon. The entire elite society of Atlanta was currently feasting on the catastrophic collapse of our family's reputation. Elias looked at me, his eyes darting frantically around the luxurious room, calculating my obvious massive net worth. He swallowed hard and made his pitch. He begged me to bail the family out. He pleaded with me to use my vast hidden wealth to immediately pay off Trey's massive corporate debts and settle the $2 million tax lien before the federal agents arrived with handcuffs. He asked me to quietly buy the silence of Chloe's personal trainer so the paternity scandal could be buried forever. He reasoned that we could send Trey away to a luxury rehabilitation center to save face and protect Vivian from the ultimate public humiliation. He invoked the concept of family loyalty, telling me that we had to protect the family name at all costs, regardless of the mistakes that had been made. He actually had the sheer audacity to ask me to finance the cover-up of the very people who had tried to destroy me. I sat perfectly still, holding my beautiful daughter in my arms, and let a freezing, absolute silence settle over the room. I looked at the man who had stood by and watched his wife throw my belongings onto the front porch 13 years ago. I looked at the man who had happily funded my brother's arrogance while ignoring my relentless hard work. I did not raise my voice. But my words were forged from absolute steel. I said no. Elias blinked, genuinely shocked by the immediate flat refusal. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead again, but I cut him off instantly. I leaned forward, locking my eyes entirely onto his. I told him, I am not a bank for my abusers. You sit in my house looking at the empire I built with my own hands, and you dare to ask me to drain my resources to save a thief and a fraud. Black wealth is not built by subsidizing toxic men. Generational wealth is not protected by throwing millions of dollars into the bottomless pit of my brother's fragile ego and my mother's psychotic vanity. You are asking me to steal from my daughter's future, to pay for your massive failures, and that is never going to happen. My father flinched as if I had struck him across the face. I did not give him a single second to recover. It was time to finalize the destruction of his complacency. I told him that the time for crying and making excuses was entirely over. I issued my final non-negotiable ultimatum. I gave him exactly 24 hours. Within that strict time frame, he had to drive back to that heavily mortgaged mansion, pack his bags, and physically leave Vivian forever. Furthermore, he had to walk directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation's field office downtown and formally file a police report against his own son for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe elder financial abuse. I leaned back against the sofa, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving resolve. I told him that if he failed to meet those exact conditions by tomorrow afternoon, I would personally send my entire unredacted file of Trey's financial crimes directly to the federal authorities. I made it crystal clear that if I had to initiate the federal investigation myself, I would not protect him. I would ensure the prosecutors viewed Elias not as a naive victim, but as a willing, complicit accomplice in Trey's massive financial fraud. I told him he would spend his twilight years sitting in a federal penitentiary right next to his golden boy. Elias stared at me, completely terrified. The realization that I held absolute tyrannical control over his freedom and his future crushed the last remaining ounce of his pride. He slowly stood up from the armchair, looking older and more broken than I had ever seen him. He did not say another word. He turned around and walked slowly out of my beautiful home, completely torn between his lifelong stubborn pride and the devastating, undeniable truth. Meanwhile, entirely across the city, Vivian was plunging headfirst into a state of absolute psychotic delusion. She had awakened in the emergency room, forcefully checked herself out against medical advice, and aggressively refused to acknowledge the DNA test that had caused her to faint. Her entire identity was so deeply tied to her public image that facing reality would literally destroy her mind. Operating in a state of pure frantic denial about the paternity, the bankruptcy, and the impending criminal charges, she drove straight to a luxury printing boutique. With her credit cards already teetering on the edge of declining, she ruthlessly bullied the store manager into rushing a massive order. She stubbornly packaged and mailed out 200 gold-leaf hand-calligraphed invitations for a $150,000 Welcome to the World gala for Trey's baby, booking the city's most elite, wildly expensive venue for the upcoming weekend. The stage for the final catastrophic slaughter was officially set. Saturday evening arrived with a suffocating heavy humidity that perfectly mirrored the tension hanging over the city of Atlanta. The sterling grand ballroom, an architectural masterpiece of vaulted ceilings and gilded archways, had been completely transformed into a blindingly white crystal-draped sanctuary of absolute denial. My mother, Vivian, had spared absolutely no expense for her highly publicized Welcome to the World gala. Thousands of imported white roses cascaded down the sweeping grand staircases and spilled over the edges of the 30 circular banquet tables. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a bright, unforgiving light on the polished marble floors, illuminating a room filled with the most powerful figures in the state. Vivian was parading through the center of the room wearing a custom silver couture gown that tightly cinched her waist and reflected the light like a walking mirror. She was actively grabbing the arms of city councilmen, prominent superior court judges, and wealthy commercial real estate developers, dragging them over to admire her grandson. She was operating in a state of pure clinical psychosis. She had completely mentally erased the medical DNA document I dropped in her lap just days earlier. In her fabricated reality, the baby sleeping in the heavily embroidered vintage bassinet was the undisputed heir to the family dynasty. She smiled widely, her teeth bright and her eyes entirely hollow, projecting the image of flawless, unbroken perfection to the elite society she worshipped. She was determined to prove to the entire city that our family was wealthy, successful, and completely untouchable. Chloe stood rigidly right next to the bassinet, looking less like a proud new mother and more like a high-value corporate hostage. Vivian had practically forced her into a heavily beaded designer dress that looked incredibly uncomfortable and restricted her breathing. Chloe's face was a tight, carefully powdered mask of sheer terror. She knew the absolute truth was out. She knew that I held the high-definition audio recording of her affair and the irrefutable DNA test proving the child belonged to a local fitness trainer. Every time a wealthy aunt or a prominent socialite leaned in to coo at the baby and congratulate her on securing the family legacy, Chloe flinched visibly. She kept darting her eyes toward the illuminated exit signs, calculating exactly how fast she could run when the inevitable explosion finally happened. She could feel the heavy oppressive weight of the diamond earrings Trey had given her, jewelry she now realized was likely purchased with stolen retirement funds. But she could not leave. She had no personal money, no independent credit cards, and nowhere to go. She was entirely trapped in Vivian's psychotic production, forced to smile graciously and nod enthusiastically, while her entire fake world slowly crumbled beneath her expensive designer heels. She was a prisoner to the very luxury she had spent her entire adult life chasing. While Vivian and Chloe maintained the grand illusion in the center of the ballroom, Trey was actively falling apart in the shadows. He was standing near the dimly lit mahogany bar tucked away in the back corner of the venue, far from the flashing cameras and the congratulatory handshakes. He was sweating profusely, the moisture soaking right through the crisp white collar of his tailored tuxedo shirt. He had a heavy crystal glass of whiskey gripped tightly in his trembling hand, chugging the dark amber liquid as if it were water. He was completely out of his mind with paralyzing fear. When his angel investors pulled their massive funding and his vendor accounts were legally frozen earlier in the week, he lost access to every single dime of corporate capital. To pay the massive non-refundable catering and venue deposits required for Vivian's ridiculous gala, Trey had bypassed the traditional banking system entirely. He had desperately reached out to unregulated, highly dangerous private lenders operating in the criminal underbelly of the city. These were not men who sent polite foreclosure notices in the mail or filed civil lawsuits. These were ruthless enforcers who broke bones and ruined lives when they did not get their money on time. And Trey knew exactly where they were. He kept glancing nervously toward the heavy service doors near the catering kitchen. Two massive, heavily tattooed men in cheap dark suits were standing just on the other side of those doors, quietly waiting for the glamorous event to end so they could collect their exorbitant interest payments in cold, hard cash. Cash that Trey absolutely did not have and could not borrow from our destitute father. He poured himself another double shot of whiskey, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing with crushing certainty that he was a dead man walking. The classical string quartet positioned on the elevated velvet stage was playing a soft, elegant arrangement that floated pleasantly over the hum of the wealthy crowd. The atmosphere was a perfect, delicate bubble of high society prestige and fabricated joy. Then the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom swung open with a loud, resounding thud. The sudden, violent noise echoed sharply across the marble floors, slicing right through the elegant music. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the musicians lowering their bows in utter confusion. The wealthy guests stopped mid-sentence, turning their heads in unison toward the entrance. Julian and I stepped through the double doors, bringing the entire gala to a complete dead halt. We did not look like the struggling, impoverished family outcasts Vivian had painted us to be on the gossip blogs. We looked like absolute royalty stepping into our kingdom. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald green gown that draped perfectly across my figure, paired with a subtle but incredibly expensive diamond necklace that caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers. Julian stood tall beside me in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo that screamed quiet aggressive wealth, his dark eyes scanning the room with the cold, calculated precision of a predator. We did not hesitate or wait for a formal invitation from the host. We walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom, our confident footsteps echoing in the total silence. The elite socialites who had mocked me mercilessly just days ago stared with their mouths slightly open, completely unable to reconcile the radiant, powerful woman walking toward them with the pathetic narrative my mother had spun. The absolute authority radiating from us commanded the entire room, forcing the crowd to literally part ways and clear a path for us. Vivian spotted us from across the room, and her flawless plastic smile instantly shattered into a look of pure hatred. The sheer sight of me standing tall and completely unbothered in her sacred high society space triggered a visceral, furious reaction deep within her. She completely abandoned the group of wealthy guests she was trying to impress, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She snapped her fingers aggressively in the air, frantically signaling the three large uniformed private security guards who were stationed near the lavishly decorated champagne and caviar buffet tables. She marched directly toward us, the heavy silver fabric of her couture gown swishing angrily with every furious step. The security guards immediately flanked her, looking highly intimidating with their coiled earpieces and serious, unsmiling expressions. Vivian stopped just 5 feet away from me, planting her hands firmly on her hips to assert her dominance. She raised her voice, ensuring every single person in the quiet ballroom could hear her absolute authority over me. She shouted, "I did not invite you. I specifically told the valet staff to turn away anyone driving a cheap car. Get this trash out of my sight right now, before I have you both arrested and dragged out of here in handcuffs for criminal trespassing." She turned to the largest security guard on her left, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest, ordering him to physically remove me from the premises immediately. The massive security guard stepped forward, reaching his heavy hand toward my shoulder to grab me. But before his fingers could even graze the delicate fabric of my emerald dress, a loud, panicked voice shouted from the back hallway. The general manager of the Sterling Grand Ballroom, a usually composed and highly professional man in a crisp, tailored suit, came sprinting across the polished marble floor. He was out of breath, his eyes wide with absolute panic and sheer terror. He forcefully shoved his way past the private security guards, practically pushing my mother aside, as if she were a minor inconvenience blocking his path. Vivian gasped in outrage, stumbling backward on her heels. The manager stopped directly in front of me, smoothing his jacket quickly to compose himself, and bowed deeply with profound, undeniable respect. He ignored my mother completely, keeping his terrified, respectful eyes entirely focused on me as he waited for my command. He said, "Everything is prepared exactly to your liking, Madam Owner." Vivian froze, the furious command dying instantly on her lips. She looked at the general manager of the Sterling Grand Ballroom as if he had suddenly sprouted a second head. She stammered, demanding to know what kind of sick joke he was playing, reminding him loudly that she was a platinum member of this club who spent thousands here every year. The manager did not even look at her. He kept his posture rigid and his eyes respectfully lowered toward me, waiting patiently for my instruction. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between my mother and myself. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Every single politician, superior court judge, and wealthy socialite was holding their breath, their eyes darting rapidly between my shimmering emerald gown and my mother's pale, horrified face. I looked Vivian dead in the eye, stripping away the final layer of her false authority with clinical precision. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the immaculate acoustics of the vaulted ceiling carried my words to every corner of the room. I asked her if she really thought I was trespassing. I smiled, a cold and hollow expression that sent a visible shiver down her spine. I said, "Trespassing, Mom." My private equity holding company finalized the purchase of this entire estate exactly 48 hours ago. You are standing on my carpet. You are breathing my air. And you are hosting this pathetic illusion of a party entirely under my roof. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was loud and undeniable. The wealthy women who had gossiped about my supposed poverty on the blogs just days ago practically choked on their expensive imported champagne. Vivian staggered backward, physically recoiling from the immense weight of my declaration. She shook her head in frantic denial, whispering that it was impossible, that I was just a lowly administrative assistant who could not afford a basic luxury membership, let alone the deed to the entire property. I did not bother arguing with her deep-seated delusion. I simply raised my right hand and gave a subtle, sharp signal to the general manager. The manager immediately turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the back of the ballroom, heading straight for the dimly lit mahogany bar where my golden brother was hiding. The wealthy crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, eager to watch the impending slaughter. Trey watched the manager approach, his face shining with a thick, greasy layer of nervous sweat. He tried to puff out his chest, desperately attempting to project the fake aura of a powerful tech mogul, but his violently trembling hands betrayed his absolute terror. The manager stopped directly in front of Trey. With crisp, professional precision, he pulled a thick, itemized invoice from his suit jacket and handed it over. Trey looked down at the heavy cardstock paper, his eyes widening in sheer horror as he read the bold total printed at the bottom. It was a bill for exactly $150,000 covering the massive catering spread, the imported white floral arrangements, the crystal chair rentals, and the premium open bar. I turned my attention away from Vivian and focused entirely on my brother. I projected my voice loudly and clearly across the silent ballroom, making absolutely sure that every single prominent investor and community leader heard my next words. I announced that new company policy dictates that any client with an active outstanding federal tax lien must pay for their private events upfront and in full. I told him that I knew his corporate bank accounts had been entirely frozen by federal authorities earlier this week. I looked at the heavy gold watch on Julian's wrist, then looked back at my brother. I said, "You have exactly 5 minutes, Trey. You have 5 minutes to settle the $150,000 balance in cash or valid credit, or I am going to shut off the power to this ballroom and have my private security physically escort your entire party out into the street." The sheer, unadulterated panic that washed over Trey was absolute and completely debilitating. He dropped his crystal whiskey glass, the heavy tumbler shattering loudly against the polished marble floor, splashing expensive amber liquor across his polished dress shoes. He frantically dug his shaking hands into the pockets of his tailored tuxedo, pulling out a thick designer wallet. He practically sprinted toward the portable point-of-sale terminal the manager was holding up. The elite guests surrounding the bar took a collective step back, pulling out their smartphones in unison. The bright flashes of camera lenses began illuminating the room as Atlanta high society actively recorded the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the golden child. Trey shoved a heavy platinum credit card into the machine. The terminal beeped instantly, a sharp, unforgiving red light flashing on the screen indicating a hard decline. Trey swore loudly under his breath, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his wallet onto the floor. He scooped it up, pulling out a corporate card, then a secondary business card, and then a premium travel card. He frantically swiped and inserted 6 different credit cards in rapid succession. Every single one of them was immediately and aggressively declined. The loud, repetitive beeping of the rejected transactions echoed through the quiet room like a digital countdown to his absolute destruction. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the ballroom, Chloe realized the absolute finality of the situation. Her fake world was entirely over, and the dangerous loan sharks were undoubtedly waiting outside the venue. She abandoned the vintage bassinet containing the baby entirely. She picked up the heavy skirt of her beaded designer dress and tried to quietly sprint toward the rear service exit located behind the catering kitchen. She did not make it far. 2 of my massive private security guards stepped smoothly into her path, crossing their muscular arms and blocking the heavy wooden doors. Chloe crashed right into them, sobbing hysterically, begging them to let her out before she was completely ruined. They did not speak to her. They simply pointed her back toward the center of the illuminated room, forcing her to stand and face the catastrophic mess she had helped create. Vivian could not process the brutal reality unfolding right in front of her eyes. Her golden son was sweating and crying over a repeatedly declined credit card machine. Her daughter-in-law was actively trying to abandon her supposed grandchild, and the daughter she had despised and discarded was standing in a position of absolute untouchable power. Vivian's fragile mind snapped entirely under the immense pressure of public humiliation. She lunged forward, grabbing my bare arm with her manicured claws, screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was a vindictive, psychotic liar, making a massive public scene over a simple banking glitch. She spun around to face the whispering crowd, her eyes wild, frantic, and entirely devoid of reason. She shouted to the room that Trey was a highly successful, brilliant millionaire chief executive officer who was just weeks away from taking his groundbreaking technology company public. She swore to the stunned judges, the politicians, and the socialites that Trey had tens of millions of dollars safely tucked away in offshore accounts. She wildly accused me of illegally tampering with his corporate credit just to humiliate the family out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She screamed that Trey was a visionary genius who did not owe anyone a single dime and that we were all witnessing a cruel, calculated setup. I smoothly peeled her shaking, desperate hand off my arm, stepping back in absolute disgust. I did not need to say a single word to dismantle her final pathetic delusion. I had my own weapon. Julian, who had been standing silently by my side, observing the entire chaotic scene with cold, calculated satisfaction, finally moved. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his midnight blue tuxedo and walked calmly up the short flight of carpeted steps to the elevated velvet stage. He bypassed the terrified string quartet musicians and walked directly over to the main audio-visual booth. He smoothly took the primary microphone straight from the trembling hand of the venue's disc jockey. Julian looked out over the sea of recording smartphones, the sobbing sister-in-law trapped by the doors, the frantically sweating brother at the bar, and the hysterically screaming mother in the center of the room. He tapped the heavy microphone twice. The sharp, booming sound cut right through Vivian's frantic screaming, plunging the grand ballroom back into a state of terrified, expectant silence. Julian finally smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, predatory expression that promised absolute, undeniable financial ruin. Julian brought the microphone to his lips and said, "Let us take a look at those millions, shall we?" Julian stood confidently on the elevated velvet stage, completely unbothered by the heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped the grand ballroom. He pulled a sleek, encrypted USB drive from the inner pocket of his midnight blue tuxedo jacket and smoothly plugged it directly into the primary port of the disc jockey's massive audio-visual console. With a few rapid calculated keystrokes, he bypassed the venue's standard screensaver. The enormous floor-to-ceiling LED screens mounted directly behind the stage, which had previously been displaying elegant, softly glowing white roses, suddenly flickered and went entirely black. A second later, the screens flared back to life, illuminating the dark room with the blinding, undeniable light of hard legal evidence. The very first document Julian projected onto the massive screens was the heavily redacted, heavily forged Legacy Family Trust. He used a digital laser pointer to highlight the specific signature line at the bottom of the page. He magnified the image until it was 10 feet tall, making it entirely impossible for anyone in the room to ignore the glaring discrepancies in the handwriting. He did not need to offer a lengthy, complicated legal explanation. The prominent superior court judges and wealthy corporate executives standing in the crowd instantly recognized the amateur desperate forgery for exactly what it was. A collective audible gasp rippled through the elite audience as they realized they were witnessing the brutal public exposure of severe elder financial abuse. But Julian was just getting started. He clicked to the next slide with ruthless efficiency. The screen shifted to display a massive, unredacted federal document bearing the unmistakable seal of the Internal Revenue Service. It was the $2 million corporate tax lien filed against Trey's supposedly wildly successful software startup. Julian let the document sit on the screen for a full 10 seconds, allowing the sheer magnitude of Trey's financial fraud to fully sink into the minds of the wealthy investors and politicians my mother had invited. He then rapidly cycled through Trey's official Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings, the massive vendor default notices, and the aggressive, high-interest loan agreements Trey had signed with the dangerous criminal lenders just to pay for this very party. The carefully constructed, heavily guarded illusion of my brother's brilliant, untouchable tech empire was systematically and entirely dismantled right in front of the entire city's elite society. The man who had been paraded around as a visionary genius was revealed to be nothing more than a desperate, pathetic fraud who had robbed his own father completely blind just to maintain his fake, arrogant lifestyle. Vivian stood frozen in the center of the room, her eyes wide and fixed on the massive screens. Her mouth opened and closed silently, completely unable to process the absolute catastrophic destruction of her golden child's reputation. But the financial slaughter was only the first phase of Julian's calculated presentation. The visual evidence had completely destroyed Trey's professional standing. But it was time to absolutely obliterate the toxic, tangled web of lies that held our twisted family together. Julian clicked a final button on the console, completely clearing the LED screens. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Then a sharp, incredibly clear audio recording began to play through the venue's massive state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. It was Nia's voice. The recording I had captured in my corporate office just days prior echoed through the grand ballroom with devastating high-definition clarity. Every single guest heard my younger sister desperately begging for a highly paid executive position, eagerly offering to sell Trey out to save herself. They heard the raw, vicious malice in Nia's tone as she gleefully exposed the darkest, most heavily guarded secret of the family. The speakers blared Nia's exact, unforgiving words detailing Chloe's reckless year-long affair with her personal fitness trainer. The audio perfectly captured Nia mocking Trey for being a weak, pathetic man who was desperately paying massive amounts of hush money out of my father's stolen retirement fund just to cover up the fake paternity and protect his fragile public image. The absolute shock that hit the ballroom was physical and violent. The elite crowd completely lost their polished high society composure. People were openly gasping, covering their mouths, and frantically whispering to each other. The camera flashes intensified, capturing every single second of the spectacular, unprecedented family meltdown. Vivian turned slowly away from the stage, her entire body shaking with a terrifying, unhinged fury. She locked eyes with Nia, who was standing near the champagne tower, looking completely paralyzed with terror. Vivian did not say a word. She marched directly over to her youngest daughter, raised her heavily jeweled hand, and slapped Nia across the face with such brutal, unrestrained force that the sharp crack echoed clearly over the whispers of the crowd. Nia stumbled backward, crying out in pain, clutching her stinging cheek. But Vivian was not finished. She turned her absolute psychotic rage toward Chloe, screaming that she was a filthy, deceitful tramp who had ruined their pure bloodline. The entire family, completely stripped of their fake wealth, their fake status, and their fake loyalty, instantly turned on each other like a pack of starved, vicious wolves. They were yelling, crying, and physically shoving each other in the center of the luxurious ballroom, providing the ultimate degrading spectacle for the wealthy society they had worshipped and feared their entire lives. Trey had been standing entirely frozen near the mahogany bar, his mind completely snapping under the immense, crushing pressure of absolute public humiliation. His fake empire was gone, his stolen money was gone, his fake child was exposed, and the dangerous loan sharks were waiting just outside the doors. He looked up at Julian, who was still standing calmly on the velvet stage, watching the chaos unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. Trey let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure, unadulterated rage. He reached down and grabbed a heavy, unopened bottle of vintage champagne from a nearby table. Gripping the thick glass neck of the bottle like a deadly weapon, Trey completely lost his mind. He charged wildly across the polished marble floor, sprinting directly toward the stage with the absolute singular intent to smash the heavy bottle directly into Julian's skull. He was screaming hysterically, his face contorted into a mask of pure, violent desperation. He never even made it halfway to the stage. My private security team, who had been carefully monitoring the entire room from the shadows, moved with terrifying, highly coordinated speed. Two massive guards intercepted Trey with brutal, unforgiving force. They did not try to gently restrain him or calmly de-escalate the situation. They hit him like a freight train. One guard grabbed Trey's extended arm violently, twisting his wrist until the heavy champagne bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered loudly on the marble floor. The second guard tackled Trey directly around his waist, using his full momentum to slam my brother brutally into a massive, heavily laden table of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The impact was spectacular and devastating. The heavy wooden table completely collapsed under their combined weight. Crystal platters of caviar, silver trays of imported cheeses, and dozens of delicate champagne flutes shattered into thousands of tiny, sparkling pieces. Trey hit the floor hard, completely buried in broken glass, crushed crab cakes, and the ruined remnants of his fake, luxurious life. He tried to thrash and fight back, screaming obscenities and demanding they let him go, but the security guards effortlessly pinned him to the marble floor, driving their heavy knees firmly into his back and twisting his arms painfully behind him. The elite crowd screamed and frantically backed away from the violent struggle, desperate to avoid the flying glass and the complete terrifying breakdown of the host family. Vivian was still screaming hysterically at Chloe, Nia was sobbing on the floor, clutching her face, and Trey was pinned down, bleeding slightly from a small cut on his forehead, looking absolutely pathetic and completely broken. I stood perfectly still near the entrance, watching the total, undeniable destruction of the toxic family that had tried to destroy me for 30 years. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No pity, no sorrow, and no regret. They had built their entire world on a foundation of lies, cruelty, and stolen money. And now they were being crushed entirely under the heavy, inevitable weight of the absolute truth. Suddenly, the frantic screaming inside the ballroom was entirely drowned out by a sound that cut right through the chaos. Loud, piercing sirens began wailing aggressively just outside the country club. The heavy, rhythmic whoop of police cruisers rapidly approaching the venue echoed through the warm night air. Brilliant. Flashing blue and red emergency lights began strobing violently through the venue's massive stained glass windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. The elite crowd completely panicked, realizing this was no longer just a scandalous family dispute, but an active, aggressive criminal raid. They frantically grabbed their designer coats and expensive handbags, desperately trying to push their way toward the side exits to avoid being associated with the impending arrests. The heavy oak double doors at the main entrance, the exact doors Julian and I had walked through just 15 minutes earlier, were suddenly and violently kicked open. A team of federal agents, wearing dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests, swarmed into the grand ballroom. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, held up a federal warrant, his voice booming over the frantic whispers of the panicked crowd. He was flanked by half a dozen heavily armed local police officers who immediately moved to secure the perimeter of the room, blocking the exits and ensuring no one could flee the scene. The elite society of Atlanta, the very people my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress, pressed themselves against the silk-draped walls, desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding criminal nightmare. The federal agents did not hesitate. They marched with practiced, terrifying precision directly across the polished marble floor, heading straight for the collapsed catering table, where my private security guards still had Trey firmly pinned to the ground. Upon seeing the federal badges, my guards immediately released their grip and took a synchronized step backward, seamlessly handing my brother over to the authorities. Trey was a pathetic sight. His custom-tailored tuxedo was torn and heavily stained with crushed hors d'oeuvres and spilled champagne. He was bleeding from the small cut on his forehead, his face pale and completely slick with terrified sweat. Two federal agents grabbed him roughly by the arms, hauling him up from the floor with zero regard for his supposed elite status. The lead agent stepped directly into Trey's face and began reading the charges loudly, ensuring the acoustics of the grand ballroom carried every single damning word to the ears of the city mayor, the prominent judges, and the wealthy investors. He announced that Trey was being placed under immediate federal arrest for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and felony elder financial abuse. The mention of elder abuse sent a fresh shockwave through the room. The crowd realized in real time that the golden child had not only defrauded his corporate investors, but had ruthlessly robbed his own father to fund this pathetic illusion of wealth. Trey did not fight back. He completely collapsed into the arms of the federal agents, sobbing loudly like a terrified child, begging them to let him call his lawyer, screaming that there had to be a massive misunderstanding. The agents ignored his frantic pleas. They aggressively pulled his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet room. Seeing her golden son securely handcuffed and being read his Miranda rights finally snapped my mother out of her paralyzed state of shock. Vivian let out a raw, agonizing scream that tore from the very bottom of her throat. She realized in that exact moment that her fake reality was permanently destroyed. And the only person in the entire world who possessed the actual wealth and power to fix this catastrophe was the daughter she had relentlessly abused. Vivian completely abandoned the last remaining shreds of her high society dignity. She ran across the ruined marble floor, slipping slightly on the spilled champagne, and threw herself directly at my feet. She fell hard onto her knees, her custom silver couture gown soaking up the spilled alcohol and crushed food. She aggressively grabbed the hem of my emerald green dress with both of her shaking hands, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric. She looked up at me, her face completely ruined by tears and smeared makeup, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. She wept hysterically, completely ignoring the hundreds of wealthy peers watching her ultimate degradation. She screamed at me to help him. She cried, saying, "Please, Zoya, please do not let them take him away. You have the money. You own this building. You can pay them off. You can fix all of this right now. He is your brother. You have to save your brother." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had systematically tried to destroy my confidence, my future, and my family, just to elevate a lying thief. I felt absolutely no pity for her tears. I felt no obligation to her desperate pleas. I had spent 30 years internalizing her cruel rejections, but tonight I was completely immune to her manipulation. I reached down and forcefully pried her shaking fingers off the hem of my dress, letting her hands fall uselessly back to the floor. I stood tall, my posture rigid and my expression devoid of any warmth or empathy. I pitched my voice perfectly, keeping it calm, icy, and entirely unforgiving. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the absolute final truth. I said you wanted a grandchild to bring glory to the family, Mom. You destroyed everyone around you just to maintain that perfect illusion. Now look at exactly what you have. You have a bastard child from a fitness trainer. You have a convicted felon for a son who is going to spend the next 2 decades sitting in a federal prison cell. And you have a primary lending bank that is officially foreclosing on your massive mansion at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I stepped back, putting physical distance between myself and her pathetic, sobbing form. I looked at the absolute wreckage of her life and delivered my final words to her. I said, "Enjoy the legacy." Vivian collapsed entirely onto the marble floor, curling into a tight ball, wailing with a sound so broken and pathetic it made the surrounding guests actively look away in deep discomfort. I did not look back at her. I turned to Julian, who offered me his arm with a look of profound, quiet pride. I looped my arm through his, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the family I had chosen, the family that actually loved and protected me. Together, we turned our backs completely on the screaming, chaotic mess unfolding in the center of the grand ballroom. We walked slowly and confidently down the long center aisle, walking past the stunned politicians and the horrified socialites. We walked past Nia, who was still sitting on the floor, clutching her red, swollen cheek, completely isolated and ignored by everyone. We walked past Chloe, who was currently being questioned aggressively by a local police officer near the service doors, her fake diamond earrings sparkling under the harsh emergency lights. We walked right past Trey, who was being frog-marched out of the building by the federal agents, his head hung low in ultimate, inescapable defeat. We did not stop to gloat, and we did not engage with the media reporters who were undoubtedly already gathering just outside the main gates. We were entirely finished with them. We were leaving the toxic family to drown completely in the exact inescapable swamp they had spent their entire lives creating. As we approached the heavy oak double doors leading out to the main lobby, a quiet, solitary figure stepped out from the shadows near the coat check desk. It was my father. Elias was not wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a simple conservative trench coat over a plain sweater. He looked 10 years older than he had just that morning, his face deeply lined with exhaustion and the heavy, lingering sorrow of absolute betrayal. But there was also a new, quiet resolve in his eyes that I had never seen before. Gripped tightly in his right hand was a large, worn leather suitcase. He had made his choice. He had driven back to the heavily mortgaged mansion, packed his belongings, and walked away from the psychotic delusion Vivian had trapped him in for decades. He had gone to the Federal Bureau of Investigation just as I demanded, handing over the undeniable proof of his son's crimes, securing his own freedom while sealing Trey's fate. He stood there silently, watching the federal agents haul his golden boy through the lobby in handcuffs. He did not cry out. He did not run to Trey. He simply watched the brutal consequence of his own blind complicity finally take its course. When Elias saw Julian and me approaching the exit, he took a deep, shaky breath and took a step toward us. He did not ask for forgiveness, knowing he had not yet earned it. He simply nodded his head, a silent acknowledgement of the new, rigid boundaries that would dictate the rest of his life. I looked at the man who had finally chosen the brutal truth over a comfortable lie. I gave him a single, brief nod in return. Julian pushed open the heavy glass doors, and the three of us walked out into the cool, refreshing night air of Atlanta. Behind us, the sterling grand ballroom was a glowing beacon of sirens flashing lights and ruined lives. But ahead of us, the night was quiet, peaceful, and entirely ours. The valet staff had already brought my sleek, armored luxury sedan to the front of the circular driveway, leaving it idling quietly while the chaos erupted inside. Julian walked around to the driver's side while I stopped for a brief moment near the passenger door. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air. It felt as though a massive, suffocating weight that I had carried since childhood had finally been lifted off my chest. I looked up at the clear night sky, the stars shining brightly over the sprawling estate that I now completely owned. Elias walked slowly over to the trunk of the car, placing his heavy leather suitcase inside. He closed the trunk with a soft click, standing quietly near the rear fender, waiting for my cue. He understood that he was not moving into my home as a demanding patriarch, but entering my world as a guest who was strictly bound by my rules. I opened my car door and slid into the soft, premium leather seat. Julian put the vehicle into gear, and we drove smoothly down the long, winding driveway, leaving the flashing red and blue lights far behind us. The sprawling wrought iron gates of the country club opened automatically as we approached, closing firmly shut the moment our rear bumper cleared the threshold. The estate was locked down. The villains were trapped inside, with the federal authorities forced to face the harsh, unforgiving light of the justice system. The empire of lies had officially fallen, and the generational wealth they had desperately tried to steal was safely locked away in the fortress I had built. As the car merged onto the quiet highway, heading back toward the absolute safety of my true family, I realized that the greatest revenge was not the destruction I had left behind. The greatest revenge was the unshakable peace I was driving toward. 3 months have passed since the flashing lights of the Federal Bureau of Investigation raid illuminated the sterling grand ballroom. The fallout was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. Trey was immediately denied bail by a federal judge who viewed him as a massive flight risk, especially after prosecutors uncovered his desperate connections to violent, unregulated criminal lenders. He is currently sitting in a cold, concrete federal detention center, facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security prison for aggravated wire fraud and felony elder abuse. The arrogant man who once bragged endlessly about his impending billion-dollar initial public offering now spends his days scrubbing cafeteria floors for 20 cents an hour. His fake tech empire completely erased from existence, Chloe did not waste a single second playing the loyal, supportive wife. The exact moment the federal agents froze all of Trey's remaining assets, she filed for an expedited divorce. However, with my father's retirement trust completely recovered and Trey's corporate accounts entirely seized, there was absolutely zero money for her to extract. Stripped of her massive closet of designer wardrobes, her luxury sport utility vehicle, and her elite social status, she packed up the baby and moved into a cramped, dilapidated trailer park on the far outskirts of the city. She now lives full-time with her personal fitness trainer. She is discovering very quickly that physical passion does not pay for custom Gucci baby shoes, expensive country club memberships, or organic groceries. They spend their days engaged in bitter, screaming arguments over unpaid bills, trapped in the exact poverty she spent her entire life running from. Nia suffered a completely different kind of spectacular destruction. Her desperate recorded attempt at corporate blackmail became the stuff of absolute legend within the competitive Atlanta business community. My private equity firm quietly ensured that every major public relations agency and high-level corporate human resources department in the state heard the undeniable audio of her betrayal. She was entirely blacklisted from the corporate world. The judgmental sister who used to look down on me for wearing unbranded clothing now wears a grease-stained, ill-fitting polyester uniform. She works the grueling graveyard shift as a waitress at a 24-hour diner off the interstate, forced to serve the very working-class people she used to mock, coming home every morning with aching feet and absolutely zero prospects for her future. But the most catastrophic collapse belonged entirely to my mother. Vivian lost her massive suburban mansion to the bank foreclosure at exactly 8 o'clock the morning after the gala. Her prestigious country club memberships were immediately revoked due to unpaid dues and the sheer magnitude of the public criminal scandal. Her wealthy friends, the elite socialites she had worshipped and protected her entire life, completely abandoned her overnight, refusing to return her frantic phone calls. The sheer trauma of losing her status completely shattered her fragile grip on reality. She now lives alone in a tiny one-bedroom subsidized apartment on the east side of town. She spends her afternoons wandering the cracked concrete courtyards in her faded silver couture gowns, desperately trying to convince her confused, pitying neighbors that she is a wealthy matriarch simply waiting for her private driver to arrive. It is a pathetic, tragic end for a woman who valued shallow appearances over her own flesh and blood. My father Elias managed to escape the burning wreckage, but not without heavy scars. True to my strict ultimatum, he fully cooperated with the federal authorities, testifying against Trey and providing the necessary documentation to secure my brother's indictment. I honored my end of the agreement on my own uncompromising terms. I purchased a comfortable, modest condo for him in a quiet, heavily secured neighborhood. However, the deed is held entirely within a strict, ironclad legal trust that only I control. He cannot sell it, he cannot borrow against it, and he cannot ever invite Vivian or Nia to step foot inside. He accepted the terms without a single complaint. He is currently attending intensive therapy twice a week, slowly unpacking decades of toxic enabling cowardice and his damaging patriarchal ego. We are not best friends, and the deep emotional wounds of my childhood will take years to fully heal. But he is trying. He comes over every single Sunday afternoon, sitting quietly in my sunroom and spending hours spoiling his true granddaughter, Maya. For the very first time in his life, he is learning how to love someone purely, without demanding absolute compliance or generating a return on his investment. The warm afternoon sun filters beautifully through the towering oak trees in our sprawling backyard. Today is Maya's first birthday party. The catered barbecue smells incredible. A lively jazz band is playing softly on the stone patio, and the air is filled with genuine, unfiltered laughter. I look around the massive green lawn and see absolutely no blood relatives, other than my father and my daughter. Instead, the yard is filled entirely with our chosen family. I see the brilliant financial analysts who helped me build my private equity firm from the ground up. I see Julian's loyal law partners and their families. I see the dedicated mentors who believed in me when I was just a broke college student working 3 grueling jobs to survive. These are the people who actually supported me, celebrated my victories without jealousy, and stood fiercely by my side during the darkest moments of my life. Julian walks over, wrapping his strong arm around my waist, pulling me close as we watch Maya toddle across the manicured grass. She is wearing a simple, bright yellow sundress, laughing uncontrollably as she chases a floating soap bubble. She is safe. She is deeply loved. And she will never ever know the suffocating, toxic weight of conditional family love. As Julian lifts Maya into his arms to help her blow out the single candle on her birthday cake, I take a step back and soak in the absolute perfection of this moment. They say blood is thicker than water, but blood can also be toxic, infecting every single thing it touches if you do not have the courage to cut it out. I did not just build wealth over these past 10 years, I built a fortress. And the greatest revenge is not watching your abusers fall from grace. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful, unbreakable life where they are never ever allowed inside.